Okay, can everybody hear me? Brilliant, thank you so much. A very warm welcome, good evening. My name is Sarah Barrow and I'm Provost Chancellor for Arts and Humanities here at the University of East Anglia. And it's a real pleasure to welcome all of you here in the room, which is a marvellous audience, and everybody out there on YouTube, wherever you are online, to join us this evening. We're really delighted. We would love it if those of you online could just give a little signal online as to where you're joining from, and we will catch up with you during the evening, and we would love to hear your comments as well. Thank you so much for joining the final inaugural lecture of this spring semester. And welcome, as we say, to those of you joining us in the Thomas Paine Lecture Study Centre and everybody joining online. Thank you so much, basically, for taking part. And I'd like to basically spend a few moments welcoming our speaker, our most important person here this evening, Professor George Lau. George Lau was born in Hong Kong and grew up in Los Angeles, California. He studied at Yale University for his 1990 BA/MA in archaeological studies. He returned to Yale to complete his PhD in 2001 in anthropology. There he was supervised by the Americanists Richard Berger, Michael Coe, and Mary Miller. It was that formation that instilled his hybrid interest in ancient art and archaeology, and which eased his move to UEA and the school. In 2002, Professor Lau joined the Sainsbury Research Unit for the Arts of Africa, Oceania, and the Americas, after a fellowship in pre-Columbian studies at Dumbarton Oaks. George is a well-known scholar on the archaeology of South America, and especially the Central Andes. Much of his work focuses on Peru's North Highlands, especially those cultures which flourish just below the glaciated peaks of the Cordillera Blanca. His commitment in the region has been both constant and multifaceted, and is centred on its dirt archaeology and visual cultures. It has crept to other facets, including outputs on ancient language, DNA, museum collections, environmental change, and mortuary practices, and earlier colonial Christianization. George has directed field projects at some of the most important pre-Inca sites of this region. Undergraduate and postgraduate students participated, as well as various specialists. In addition to being editor of the World Art Journal, now in its 12th year, he's published really widely, extensively, including 4 monographs and a recent co-edited Spanish volume. These spotlight the North Highlands in broader discussions of ritual practices, social organisation and warfare, and material expressions of identity. His current field project centres on the rise of ancient Andean social complexity, polities, and this is what he'll be discussing today. Please let's pay a warm welcome and a huge congratulation to Professor George Lau. Thank you very much.
Thanks very much. Thanks very much. Can you hear me? Testing. Great. Thanks very much, Sarah, Prof Vice Chancellor, for that introduction. Should I turn this off, or is it okay? Let me. And also to the faculties as well as the event staff for making all the preparations and for hosting this. I'd like to also acknowledge the School of World Art Studies and Museology, for whom I've always had a fond respect and collegiality with, and the various stimulating exchanges over the years with both the people and the students there. A special word of thanks to all of my colleagues, also at the Sainsbury Research Unit, especially its director, Professor Steve Hooper, who has captained the ship there and my time here with great fairness and wisdom over the years. Tonight is really special for me as an occasion, and so thanks to all of you who have taken time out of your schedules to make room for this, especially on this dismal, wet evening, and also for those who are tuning in virtually from afar. For various reasons, I'm looking at the mouse here, which doesn't seem to... having a little bit of trouble. It's okay. I think it's just the mouse, lack of a mouse pad, but I'm able to scroll now. Thanks, Hannah. Especially those tuning in from virtually from afar, for various reasons, it's not always been possible for my family and my friends to view from the States, for example, or from Peru. And so this occasion tonight, which I think is live streamed and will be recorded, will be a nice thing to have and also to engage those not here tonight with us. So what I'd like to do today is twofold. Basically, what I would like to do is discuss the relevance of the ancient Andes for knowing about ancient art and social complexity. And I'll be doing this by way of some comparative reflections on my engagements with these topics as related to 3 archaeological projects in the high Andes that I've been involved in. I suppose the main point is that the ancient Andes has much to add to the study of ancient arts and cultures in general. And for me, these are inextricably linked, both as an outcome, a natural outcome of the field research and the analysis after, but also as a kind of intellectual journey that I've been able to take during my time here, largely at UEA. As many of you know, much of my fieldwork and writings have been on Peru's ancient past, and especially the North Highlands. My initial interest in this region was born out of the great allure of the Andes Mountains, especially the cultures that arose at the foot of the Cordillera Blanca. But perhaps more pragmatically, it was born out of an ambition to fill a gap in its archaeology, to study a culture, Recuay, which had long been known in the literature, but which had been, for various reasons, poorly evidenced and recognized. This is, of course, something all of us implore to our students. Go out there, get new data, fill a gap, engage the literature. Pretty simple. Well, in the mid-90s, when I was beginning my PhD, Peru, and especially its rural highlands, were still recovering from years of shining path terrorism, which had sunk local economies and tourism and created unrest and disquiet for millions. The violence also curtailed what little systematic archaeology there was in the highlands at the time. I was also keen to help rectify a biased record, rather than concentrate on tombs and ceremonial occupations that others had already gravitated to. I had the somewhat high-minded, but now entirely rookie idea of studying the village community in its various dimensions, from the economic to the ceremonial, from the pot to the potato, from the camelid bone to feline stone sculptures. Fast forward 2.5 decades, and I find that I'm still studying Recuay village communities, including those to be discussed tonight. I suppose the lesson here is threefold. First, those years cemented my interest, if only because they spotlighted the neglect accorded to highland peoples in the past and in the present. And that's been a viewpoint that I've been trying to scrutinize and help fill ever since. Second, the archaeological record of the Central Andes is remarkably vast and can usually absorb research interests of most sorts. And that's largely because of its myriad vibrant cultures, most of which have barely been studied. Thirdly, the longstanding focus doesn't mean that our understandings are neutral. In fact, with more work and many more colleagues now than ever, before, as seen in the recent edited volume mentioned by Sarah, we're in We're able to transcend the dissatisfactions of single cases and examples to thinking about variability and regional patterns through time, which continue as central aims in prehistoric archaeology, and gives us a picture, a very necessary one, for time and culture change. So this talk thus provides a really nice chance for me to take stock of previous work. And it helps me also to conceptualize some writing that I'm doing for a new book on the Recuay and complexity. This has been, over the years, engrossing for me because we're discovering that what we think to be core Andean cultural and socio-political features and practices, such as those typical for the Inca, may have very early expressions in Recuay culture. And here is just simply a time-space diagram showing where Recuay is located. We're really talking about the first 7 centuries AD for the distribution of Recuay culture in time. So take, for instance, feasting and labor mobilization, which the archaeologist Joan Jarrow noted for Recuay some years ago, but is particularly well known for the later Inca culture. Because the ancient Andes was a world without money, what politics emphasized was labor, or more properly, the ability to organize labor of those around you. This is what the historian Susan Ramirez called wealth in people, rather than wealth focused in money or goods. Here are a few images from famous illustrated accounts of the Inca Empire and society. On the left-hand side, Martin Murua, and the other Wamapomo de Ayala, who famously make illustrations that are almost always used probably more by archaeologists than any other group of scholars. Hosting parties replete with beer and food paid back people for their contributions to crucial collective tasks, such as farming, irrigation, or building things. Festive generosity was extremely common in village circumstances and remains important now in various villages today. And it was also a practice famously co-opted by the Inca to underwrite their colossal empire, which the French anthropologist Maurice Godelier called the Inca mode of production. So on the left side, another image from Murua. Up on the right side, an image from the Recuay culture some 1,000 years before, which focuses on similar issues of labor obligations or reciprocal drinking that may lead to labor obligations. Another practice that we think of as being quintessentially Andean is ancestor veneration, where the dead and the articles of them are curated and periodically celebrated, and sometimes with drink. Now, funerary cults with mummies are well known throughout Andean prehistory, but its configuration with burial repositories and house compounds associated with kin groups or extended families, as the archaeologist Bill Isbell commented on, don't really get much play before they appear in the North Highlands during the early centuries AD. And Recuay groups, of course, were early adherents of this practice, and I'll return to this later. So an image from Wamapomo de Ayala, and then some Recuay materials on the right, showing precisely the kinds of things that we understand as ancestor veneration in later prehistory. Of course, this isn't to forget Recuay's early emphasis on large-scale hilltop towns in the high Andes. Despite their issues with water, winds, and frosts, fortified villages atop hilltops, ridges, and summits come to dominate highland settlement patterns and lifeways until colonial times. Tonight, I'd like to add that groups across the Recuay area were also early to adopt the idea of herd wealth and military status for constructing political authority. Talking a big game about success in war and control of camelids becomes bound up with the art and ideology of good leadership. Evidence for some of these practices manifest early, to be sure, but I would argue that nowhere do they package together so fully and so early together as they did in Recuay. And one might say Recuay artists were codifying the visual language of Andean leadership and noble prerogatives long before the colonial writers Guamampoma and Marua did it for their readers and Western scholarship ever since. For the Recuay themselves went to great lengths to show these new orientations in their art. By this, I'm meaning broadly their finely made things made to celebrate the society's nobles. This included fancy ceramic vessels, metal adornments, stone sculptures, textiles, as well as fine stonework and constructions. These were conspicuous luxury items for the living and the dead alike, for the Recuay curated their esteemed deceased as wrapped bundles and kept them close at hand and gave them the same finery and privileges that they commanded in life, such as transport in litters, fancy headdresses, and special weapons. Recuay art developed after the Chavin civilization, and all signs point to a great rupture with previous artistic forms and orientations. I think this was because Recuay art was fundamentally about heroic ancestors and local funerary cults, and not the supernatural worlds and bestiaries so crucial in Chavin's shamanic cosmology. Recuay has always struck me as a deliberate and honest art, not overtly about masks, secrecy, or obfuscation like we have in Chavin and other Andean art styles. Its candor and its narrative legibility are rooted in its aspirational gaze to openly depict and distinguish its chiefly leaders and respective collectives. The compositions commemorated the central roles that leaders increasingly had as they interacted in life and in death, with a range of beings seen as crucial for the group's success. These may be with their human partners and families, their attendants or soldiers, but also with non-humans like animals, ancestors, and divinities. This little schematic shows the range of figural vessels by Recuay potters, which highlights how the chiefly person is the focus of attention, is always the focus of attention. Such interactions justified their central identity as leaders, and we can also discern how their person, the idea of their leader, as Gell or Strathern might predict, was constructed and extended through art-like things and people around them. Just as the pomp and ritual of processions, weddings, deaths, and coronations make new kings and queens, so too did the Recuay mark the stylized practices vital to making their lords and ladies. And like crowns, regalia, and trumpet salutes are critical to receive royal persons today, a range of things played similar roles on behalf of Recuay nobles. In short, art often mediates the relations of inequality, and this is very true of the Andean past. Let's now look a little bit more closely at those archaeological contexts. I've had the great privilege of working at 3 very interesting Recuay tradition sites, archaeological sites, and I've learned so much from my time at these places, and especially from the people who live nearby, because one can't really help but be drawn into their deep sense of place and history, stories after stories, place after place, which compounds this idea of regional variability. Here on the left is basically an image of modern-day Peru, or the Andean area. The area in green is highlighted is the area for the spatial distribution of Recuay culture. It's actually probably evolved somewhat today. On the right, we have a blow-up of the area, and those highlighted in green are the 3 villages that I'll be talking about, or the 3 settlements that I'll be talking about today. The area that is shown in light blue is the Cordillera Blanca. This region is distinctive because of its dramatic environmental diversity and the resources and affordances of this vertically compressed landscape, which are duly pegged to temperature, rain, and elevation. So in a single day, one can drive eastward, moving from sea level or the ocean and the coastal deserts to high mountain peaks and glacial lakes, and then descend into the humid foothills of the upper Amazon. And this all happens in an area a little bit larger than the size of Switzerland. The compressed and vertical landscape predisposed Recuay culture in several ways. First, to locate settlements near zones to optimize for farming and for herding. The limited lands for this dual economy paired well with living in highly defensible locations up high in relatively isolated and buffered positions. This had the collateral effect, intentional or not, of limiting regular large-scale interaction socially and for goods. Now, all three sites that I'll be talking about today were essentially village communities, and I put up this chart, and I hope you can read it, basically as a kind of shorthand, because trying to go through each one of these categories would be impossible. Suffice it to say, the main overlap, of course, is during the Recuay period, and that these communities were of different sizes and means, each with, they were also internally differentiated, each with houses and ceremonial buildings. And we can also identify contexts that can be higher status, made of better architecture, or having contained more exclusive materials and resources. We now know that Recuay broadly was constituted by a series of peoples organized into various non-state or pre-state political groups. At the largest scale were basin-wide polities we might liken to lordships discussed in early Spanish chronicles of the region. Yino and Pashash, the two columns to the right, may have been such regional centers. At the other spectrum, we have a series of smaller villages, hamlets, and dispersed farmsteads, which seem to have been largely independent. Or at various times, they may have formed coalitions and larger arrangements that were short-lived for ritual, work, and conflict. Despite constituting part of the same cultural system then, they still show very important internal differences due to local technical traditions, kinship ties, access to labor, and economic productivity. One can also imagine highly particular histories tied to local landscapes, such as mountains and lakes and other important features, as well as contingent relations with neighbors, both internal and along the border. And it's precisely this regional cultural variability that is relevant, indeed fundamental, I think, for thinking about power relations in the ancient Andes, and specifically for Recuay, and for moving beyond the traditional blanket understandings of ancient cultures and their influence. How do we do this? Well, I think a community's arts is a good place to start. Recuay was a cultural tradition that turned on some core features. And if you were to, tie me up, I'd boil it down to 5 key elements: ceramics, stone sculpture, architecture, special imagery, and practices having to do with mortuary. Their presence presumes sharing also of cultural dispositions and knowledge that this material and their use embed. But how they acted with these, or how these villages acted with these, could be very similar or be very different. Notably, each of the settlements under discussion had very distinctive dispositions having to do with fancy material culture. And this is what I'd like to move on to now. Chinchawas was a small village or hamlet situated right at the upper limits of agriculture. It measures only about 4 hectares in size and had a few dozen small house structures. During its height, around AD 600, it was probably home to only about 100 people. And here you can see its location right at the upper limits of agriculture, about 3,800 meters or so. You can see the mosaics of fields on the other side of the valley. The truly unusual thing about Chinchawas was the abundance of stone sculpture still at the site. We documented over 40 carvings there and 3 in situ, which is very rare indeed. This is the most ever documented at a single Recuay settlement, and no small number given that only about 750 are known for the entire culture. This is a plan of the site, now fairly old, and I'm not sure whether it makes sense, but those small triangles are where we found stone sculptures. Those areas highlighted in light blue and yellow were areas where we made test pit excavations. These carved blocks at Chinchawas are amongst the most diagnostic of Recuay remains. The central human figure, flanked by felines, is a common theme in both ceramics and in stone carving, and is basically to exalt the central figure. These were originally placed in tomb buildings and as lintels and jambs for high-status houses and public ceremonial spaces. And all evidence indicates that they depicted ancestors or ancestral beings associated with the buildings. We know that they used local stone and that their carving was probably done by artisans attached to the kin groups rather than by centralized full-time workshops. Many are found today inside small walled courtyards, and if the mouse is working, this is one of these courtyards, and this is in fact a sculpture right there. Many are found in these courtyards, where we also managed to unearth quite a bit of evidence for feasting, mainly broken serving vessels and animal bones that indicate the kinds of parties or the kinds of get-togethers that Andean leaders may have hosted in exchange for labor. The site itself is pretty small and without monumental buildings. Thus, most effort or most labor at the site was given to making these representations of ancestors who lorded over these spaces as witnesses and patrons of their own veneration. In short, the denizens of Chinchawas were of fairly limited means, yet managed a very vibrant sculptural tradition which flourished for some 400 years, and at least over 40 sculptures. Yino is on the other side of the spectrum and really is one of the jewels in Andean archaeology. At 25 hectares, the settlement core alone could have enveloped 6 villages the size of Chinchawas. It's impressive due to its high location and also its vantage for the tall glaciers of the Cordillera Blanca, including the twin peaks of Huascaran, the tallest of the range, of which you can see the sort of the northern part on the far left-hand side. Yino is well preserved because it's not easily accessible, and this has also helped to limit looting at the site. Restricted access also must have been a reason for its original siting. And this is a wall facade of one of the large enclosures, which I'll talk more about now. Now, great effort was dedicated above all to monumental architecture at this site. Our research documented many compounds of circular or rectangular plan, and the largest rectangular one measures, for example, 35 meters on a side. The largest circular compound, meanwhile, measures about 28 meters. The excavations found domestic refuse in all of them, including hearths, milling stones, and general refuse discard, but no burials or tombs. Here on the right is a plan of the site. I hope it's clear. Those highlighted in red are the circular compounds. Those highlighted in yellow are the rectangular ones. And so you can see a variation in size as well, and that's basically what the plots are showing on the left, what sorts of extensions or area coverage that are being enclosed by the walled compounds. Essentially, you find some wall compounds which are giant and others which are much smaller. And of course, those bigger ones are also the ones that are treated to the most architectural elaboration. All signs point to permanent occupation by many coeval groups living in the village, but some groups at Yino were clearly more able to build larger and more elaborate compounds. These were the ones with the most impressive stone masonry, and also had features like higher walls, niches, drainage, and massive entrance stones. In fact, it's clear, given the high walls, that these groups probably didn't like interacting with each other that often at the settlement. And that for that reason, we might think of them as compounds for competing extended families or lineages. So the focus of creativity and labor at Yino was thus directed at monumental architecture. And this is how I suspect wealth was, in terms of labor, how it played out in material form. We found some broken fragments of stone sculpture, but few when compared to the Chinchawas site just described. So what I've shown thus far may be a little head-scratching, since we have a small hamlet, Chinchawas, with a lot of stone sculpture, and then an impressive monumental center with barely any. Yet both communities emphasized stone and highlighted its qualities such as longevity, scale, and color through transformative work for others to see. Fortunately, complementary data are now emerging at Pashash, the final village that I'll be discussing today, where in 2019 we began a large multi-year project focused on ancient polities and systems of authority focused on northern Peru. The co-PI on this is David Chiquan, a former student of UEA and of the Sainsbury Research Unit, and now professor of anthropology at LSU in the States. We're studying the rise of native polities, and he's directing a comparative case study in the coastal valley adjacent to this area in the coastal valley foothills of Nepena. The overall project proceeds from a fairly straightforward premise that the first key steps leading to divinely sanctioned lords happened in the house, not just any house, but in the big palatial complexes that we think of as being the residence of a ruler and his or her family. This is a digital elevation model and a map of the site. On the left is the main area where we've been working. It's known as La Capilla. I think it shows some of the operations that we did in 2019. It's a very large site, and so we've only really scratched the surface in investigating it. But nonetheless, there's some really interesting results. Why do we think we have this premise? Well, it's because kin groups will want to keep their ancestralized dead close by as physical things for memory and for legitimation. Our hypothesis, therefore, is that emerging nobles will begin to build their ancestral shrines directly into the palace. And this has the advantage of keeping others away from their most precious treasures or valuables, namely the ancestral bundles and their ritual equipment, while also enabling quick and regular access to their veneration or for their veneration over time. And happily, this is precisely what we've been getting at Pashash, at least. So this is a drone image of the site today. This is the La Capilla sector, I just mentioned previously. What you can see here is a large building, and see if the mouse works here. And this, we've been focusing on this area, known as Sector 1. And just draw your attention to this large squarish building here, of which you can only really see the sort of east facade. That east facade is marked by a string course, a slightly projecting frieze that separates the upper and lower levels. It's largely a solid building, but we've been focusing on excavations here, and in 2019 we also excavated here. You can see it's largely quadrangular, although this face has largely collapsed. We think that this was also the area where the main staircase was. because we've been finding vestiges of that during our excavations this past summer. The staircase basically zigzagged up and back and forth as you get up to the top. We've also been excavating down below from the compound, which revealed a series of agglutinated structures, that is to say, sharing walls of domestic structures, and then also domestic structures here, as well as another series of domestic structures there. These seem to have been sort of areas for the residences of more common people, reserving the area up top. We may call it something like an acropolis, or has the feel of an acropolis, for the most elite or the most powerful of people at Pashash. I'm going to see if the drill. So you just get a feel of the landscape as well as the scale. As Recuay sites go, it's not that big, but what's big are the stones, for one thing. And what's big is also the kind of thinking about what went into making a monument for these Recuay peoples. It was basically a palatial compound. In our first field season, we uncovered an extraordinary offering cache. This included many whole serving vessels in Recuay style, ceramic and stone figurines, pendants, many of camelids, and items with mosaic inlays. There were 2 effigy vessels of important animals in Recuay culture, camelids and condors, creatures that are native to the region and evidently of great importance to the nobles of Pashash. This was one of 5 discrete caches near the tomb of an important Recuay burial found in previous work in the 1970s. Notably, the carbon 14 dates, pottery style, and the discrete context tell us that these caches were made at different points in time. The recent cache that we've just found dates to about AD 250, while the others date later, suggesting that there was at least a 200-year-long period in which offerings were accorded to a very important person buried at the top of that complex. And we think of that being of early phase, part of the early phase, and perhaps even the founding of the compound. And so this ritual continued for some time after the founding. So what we have here are those effigy vessels as well as some fancy vessels found associated with the offering. These are very diagnostic of the Recuay style, using a very hard kaolinite white clay paste. The offering also included 2 discrete bunches of gilt metal pins, and one was tied together almost like a bouquet. These are garment pins, and there are pottery depictions which show them being worn by women, fastened to their apparel at the shoulders. These are exceptionally well preserved, some surviving with bits of cloth and thread clinging to the pin stem and to the holes. We've been able to conserve and stabilize most of the pins from further corrosion, and this has allowed us to determine that many of the pins are of solid cast heads. The pin designs show creatures common in Recuay imagery, such as foxes, felines, and raptors, while others have mythical elements. These are probably the tutelary beings for the Pashash nobles, not unlike lions or griffins in medieval heraldry, or the clan crests of the Northwest Coast groups of North America, which in a few weeks' time you'll be able to see at the Sainsbury Center. What the pots don't show is that many pins were also rattles. These have hollow conical heads, each containing small, finely chipped stones, and when shaken or when moved around, the rattles and produce a light clinking sound. Such pins are very rare in Recuay culture, actually in Andean archaeology full stop, and the delicate sound they produced must have been extraordinary, if not completely novel, for the highland groups. No doubt they featured to show the high status of their users, but also emphasized the special ritual time for the occasions in which they featured, like processions, observances, and other ritual displays. So I wanted just to mention where some of those pins are worn. I hope this. Well, you can see the woman who's holding an infant wears garment pins at her shoulders. And then on the right, you have a man and a camelid who's playing a panpipe. And his ear spools also feature this interesting fringe, which must have denoted some kind of status, such as shown on these. This animal is the very famous or iconic Recuay crested animal, which is very typical for this Recuay culture and seems to have been a mythical creature in the traditions of the Recuay peoples. When the pins depict humans, they are high-status lords shown frontally, full-bodied, or only with the heads. And the spiky fringes are of interest because they relate the figures to solar radiance and fiery heat, like piercing spokes radiating outwards. Of course, metals, light, and brilliance, and I'm not the first to say this, of course, being very closely intertwined in Amerindian thought about vision, solar associations, and rulership. And one can imagine that the clinking was part of their resplendent display. We've also now uncovered 18 new stone sculptures to add to the overall Recuay corpus. Most of the stones would have graced the interior walls of the main compound. Some get reused as common stone or sometimes as curiosities in later buildings. And there are some with geometric motifs and others with zoomorphic figures such as avians and felines and beings with mythical features. Some forms are completely unprecedented, such as this sculpture of a condor with its stepped mount. It was found just outside the main compound in that area where the staircase is thought to have been located and appears to have been dislodged around the same time that the main facade and that staircase collapsed. Remarkably, we were able to recover the beak and the head fragments, although they were located many meters apart. This form is extremely rare in Andean sculpture, and it may have been part of a special cult known during historical times from the neighboring region just to the north. It might be mentioned that we took all the sculptures to the Archaeology Museum in the nearby town of Cabana, and this one was by far the trickiest, as it weighs nearly half a ton and required about 16 people and a litter, a makeshift litter no less, to carry it down the hilltop to the nearest spot where we could plop it on a vehicle. The final items I want to single out are these little pottery figurines found also in that offering dating to about 80, 200, 250. These are fairly unassuming objects in terms of scale and their modeling, but I believe they're actually quite critical for recording changing complexity in the ancient Andes. These kinds of depictions are best known from museum collections where there are larger and more elaborate versions, such as the ones I just showed. But they all focus on a critical theme for Recuay peoples, a well-attired man holding or standing next to a roped camelid, a llama or an alpaca, and featuring the regalia of war and ceremony, usually shields, trophy body parts, or flutes. That is to say, the figurines explicitly had elements to express the individual's high status and association to warfare and herding. Because we found them in context, we're able to add now that they date, again, fairly early to the Recuay tradition, and moreover, date to the same time period when elites established control and started building the palatial compound. Now, in this respect, I'm reminded of the art historian George Kubler's famous, if somewhat contentious, idea of prime objects for artistic solutions that come out of the blue to initiate a formal sequence of replications and copies later. Prime objects need not be masterpieces, but they are pioneering and consequential due to their place in being caught up in major historical transformations and changing, shall we say, regimes of value, which have as their outcomes artworks. The artistic solution here was ideological and ultimately enduring for Andean peoples. For the first time in the record, we begin to see depictions of individuals celebrated for their capacity in war and in managing camelids. And of course, these are the terms which essentially defined the success of later highland polities, the kingdoms, sought after by the Inca and Spanish eyes. So in this lecture, what I've discussed are three places where distinctive arts developed as part of the material records of their settlements. Rather than being one-offs or normative across the culture, I've attempted to show how local groups in all three contexts made art central but variable to the social relations of community and leadership before the Incas. Artworks, we might say, operated in the interpersonal domain, those spaces between people which connected them in new kinds of complexity during the first millennium AD. What's reassuring to me is that the arts of this ancient world are messy and highly localized. The attention to elaboration and creativity varied, but this should hardly be a surprise when we consider the vast and heterogeneous past of Andean collectives. Yet what is predictable is how Andeans so greatly valued the outcomes of collaborative efforts crystallized in things. For the Recuay, we see this mainly in their stonework, especially monumental stonework such as at Yino. But for other Andean cultures, it may have been piling millions of adobe bricks for their burial temples, or for weaving miles of fine thread for their textiles. I suspect this is because Andean work is really also an aesthetic domain and a great source of collective identity. Something functioning well takes work, like an irrigation canal or tilling the earth. And this may be as rewarding as weaving garments or building cyclopean walls. These may require many years, if not generations, of coordinated effort, infinitesimal bits of work that only culminate on occasion. Similarly, their appreciation or their payoff is almost as seldom, but can be sometimes quite marvelous. I want to close with a few final reflections about what next for Recuay. In recent years, there's been a great sense of gratification for me in seeing that Recuay and the Recuay record now is creeping into that sort of phase of its scholarly life when it bears on the big questions in Andean archaeology, whether it's complexity, symbol and value systems, gender, interaction, or simply culture change. In fact, I think it would be missing a step now to have any comprehensive discussion on these matters during the first millennium AD without countenancing Recuay. What's more, the archaeology is now engaging those communities where ancient knowledge is literally being rediscovered and newly mobilized for many kinds of audiences. It's worth noting that all of the project's artifacts are kept in the town's small museum. And one of the rewarding things that we were able to do this past summer was work with the museum on a temporary exhibit that coincided with the town's patron saint festival, but also the Independence Day festivals in July. And this had the dual effect of bringing in visitors for the museum, but also informing the various visitors about our research. And here you can see that sculpture laboriously brought to the museum and now kept there. Ultimately, it's crucial that local citizens especially can see the materials and develop their own opinions about our interventions there. And of course, many also visit us while we're at the site. They can consider the hard work and decisions that feed into the process both ancient and modern, and begin to develop answers for how arts and monuments past made by the people can be for the people. No doubt these fancy Recuay things and places will again need to take center stage if and when site museums and formal heritage development protocols come to pass. Thank you very much.
Congratulations.
Thanks very much.
Wonderful. Oh, where's the thing? Thank you, George. That was absolutely wonderful. I was struck by how you gave so much credit to others in that lecture, and yet you have facilitated that work, enabled it, led it, and been the scholar behind it. So I wonder if we might give George a round of applause for being such a wonderful scholar behind this incredible work, if you wouldn't mind giving. Thank you. It's a very generous lecture, which we really appreciated, giving great kind of credit to everybody you've been involved in. Obviously a very collaborative effort, but acknowledging the many people that you've worked with along the way, which is really remarkable. Thank you. We do have time for some questions, both here and maybe, I don't know if we have some from those people listening online. I know Hannah is coming forward with, but let's just give a little pause to see if anybody here in the audience has an initial question before we, yes, we have one from the back here. Oh no, we have one further down, and then at the back, and then we'll go online, because I have a feeling Hannah's got some questions in her hand. Great.
Thank you, George, for a very interesting talk. I'm interested in this aspect of the camelids with warfare. If you look at the Incas, they sort of seem to equate on some level agriculture with warfare. Do you think that within these Recuay cultures there is on some level an equation between camelids, camelid management and warfare?
Oh, that they're paired sort of economic and symbolic domains. That's an interesting question. I suppose I haven't thought about it in that way, partly because sort of agriculture from the Recuay standpoint is poorly known. What we do have, of course, as was mentioned, is a lot of milling stones. So we know that they were obviously growing the common cultigens at high elevations, such as the tubers and quinoa, but the degree to which it was dichotomous and sort of harmonious, if you will, with herding and warfare, at least I can't see them with as explicitly shown in the artworks.
Thanks.
I think we have Jago at the back. Thank you. And then we'll go online. So if anybody else in the audience has a question, just keep it there for a moment.
Thanks, George. Amazing lecture. Really enjoyed it. Peru's a country where the cultural heritage is incredibly well developed for tourism, and yet Recuay has often been off that map to date. How would you like to see sustainable tourism be developed following some of the great discoveries and sites that you've been working on?
Yeah, it's a good question, and it's outside of really my expertise, although obviously we can sort of consult in that process. There's a formal protocol for turning archaeological sites into heritage monuments readily available for tourism. They're called puestas en valor, or puestas en valor. This is a long process, involves a lot of levels of ministerial action, a lot of input from specialists and conservators, as well as the various stakeholders interested in their enterprise. This is something that, of course, I'd love to see at a place like Yino or Pashash. There are, in fact, movements or initiatives done by local politicians now in that trying to get that together. And to the extent that we can, we provide them with some information. But it's something that is largely outside of the purview of the research project, but it's something that we'd like to, obviously keep a pulse on.
Thanks so much. Hannah, do you have some questions?
I do have one from Stephen Wegner. What things may have constituted the glue that held the far-flung and diverse Recuay settlements together and maintained some shared cultural elements?
Thanks, Steve. Steve is a longtime colleague of mine. So this is kind of a softball, if you will. As I mentioned, those 5 things are crucially important. So stone sculpture, pottery, fine pottery, architecture, imagery, and mortuary practices. I think all of them contribute to what we understand as being the commonalities that are particularly shared by Recuay groups. If I had to say, it's the kind of beliefs behind what makes those either items or practices work, which draw them together. And so it's a kind of commonality or of beliefs, or the cosmology behind those beliefs, and what sort of drives them to depict those crested felines, or put ancestor images on their burial monuments. Now, sometimes you find these elsewhere in Andean cultures, neighbors of the Recuay, for example, but rarely ever do you find them all together in this bundle. So what makes the Recuay culture, and what keeps them together? Well, it was sharing in these beliefs that contributed to these 5 different elements.
Thank you, Steve, for what was apparently a softball question. That's really appreciated, I'm sure. Hannah, anything further online?
No questions, but just lots of love for you, and just saying how wonderful you are, basically, in your research. So,
including from Peru, I think.
Yes,
we have some incomers from Peru, don't we?
We do,
Which is
yeah.
lovely. Thank you. Thank you to everybody joining us online. It's really appreciated. Do we maybe have one final question? Yes, from the front. Just if you wouldn't mind waiting for the microphone, because it means we can capture you in the best possible way.
Hi, George. Thanks, William, for that. That was great. I just had a question about the frequency of sculptures. You were saying that in the settlement that there was 40 over 400 years. Do you think that there was more that you're just not accounting for? Or is it a case of they were using their skills in other ways and only occasionally turning them towards sculpture? Thank you.
Yeah, sorry, that may have been unclear. Certainly there were probably more sculptures at the site. In fact, our project, when we began work there, wasn't the first visits by archaeologists and certainly by visitors. So there are sculptures that actually had been documented that no longer exist, or that have been lost or taken in some way. But almost certainly there were more sculptures at the site. How that figures in, I mean, it's a good question in the sense that the numbers of sculptures are probably related to the numbers of buildings that they probably decorated at any sort of one moment in time. So again, if we're talking about what 20 generations or 15 generations, you might have some lineages who are using these sculptures or making them and then adorning their buildings with them. So over time, you have this accumulation or this accrual of sculptures at the site. But it probably was never a huge production. And it's one of the good questions. There are various scholars who are working now who are looking at the idea of production, or the techniques of production, also the sources for the stone. And what they're coming up with I think aligns with what we're thinking, that this was sort of kin groups who were making these sculptures periodically and through time, but never making, say, a dozen at a time. Rather, it was probably 1 or 2 or 3 each time a burial monument was made, or for an enclosure. And so over time, you had something like maybe 4 or 5 dozen, at Chinchawas at least.
I've been advised we have time for one more question, so brilliant. Hold on, one sec, Joe. Wait for the mic.
Hi, George. I'm interested in the plan, I think it is of Yino. I don't know if you can go back to that plan.
I can probably. Let me just check.
And this harks back to a discussion we had years ago at one of my own research seminars. Could you explain the duality or the difference between the circular and the rectangular structures? What does that mean?
Sure. Now, I can try to explain it. Now, I don't have a perfect answer, or certainly one that's based on evidence. There are two ways of thinking about it. I think one is thinking about the different forms as somehow being related to the groups who are making them. Obviously, they're related in some way. There's a long-standing emphasis in the Andes about dualism. And one of the ways that that gets played out, at least during late prehistoric times, as well as in early colonial times, was that you had moieties of people who were basically similar peoples, but who but they developed communities together. Sometimes these moieties would be, in fact, herders. Other times they were, in fact, or the other moiety were agriculturalists. They also had different gods, and they, in a sense, they had different ways of doing things, but nevertheless lived together. And so they were paired in these communities. That may be what's happening here, but when we find or we look at the remains in them, they're basically the same. So that sort of model maybe is thrown out the window if we think that pottery somehow reflects, social divisions, which of course that's also been problematized. The other way of thinking about this is how they're perhaps developed as sort of paired buildings, because as you can see, they're really organically organized. There isn't much planning involved, and they develop over time as if this sort of moiety system operated in the deep past, maybe that was a way of working out how they reflected themselves or manifested themselves to others. Now, what we can say is that, and I think I alluded to it, but maybe it wasn't particularly clear, that all of these buildings are pretty high up. Their access wasn't easy, so you'd have to take a ladder to get up and over, except for a few occasions. And they're high walls without windows. So whatever they were doing, they didn't really like seeing the other groups. It's like high hedges, right? Or making hedges as permanent and high as possible. And I think, this kind of living together was perhaps, if you were to hold a gun to my head, and sorry, that's a bad way of putting it, but if you were to force me into giving a hypothesis, maybe these people were living there out of necessity rather than convenience. And of course, what might have been necessary was to sort of bind up when others around you are stealing from you or threatening your life.
Thank you so much, George. And actually, that seems to be very pertinent to current day concerns, doesn't it, actually,
yes.
in Peru? So thank you for bringing us to that note. Thank you, Joe. I'd like to say a huge thank you to all of you, to everybody out there who's dialed in and contributed, but mostly a thank you and many congratulations again to Professor George Lau. Thank you.
Thanks very much, Sarah.
Oh, and I think I'm now supposed to invite you, of course I will, to a little drink outside.